Welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us today. Today's webinar is presented by Sports Field Management Association. This week is the first of our four-part series of post-conference education. Our featured speakers today are Dr. Adam Thoms, Associate Professor at Iowa State University, Thomas Gould, Research Scientist at Iowa State University, and Joshua Tvrdik, Turf and Grounds Manager for the Iowa State Athletics Department. Today, they will be presenting from cornfield to a college football field. Attendees will be muted during the presentation. If you have any questions, please use the Q&A feature on your screen. Please type in your questions and they will be answered during the presentation. Thank you for joining us today. You may go ahead and get started.
Thanks, Kristen, and I appreciate everybody for taking the time to join in today. We're going to talk about a fun project that we did, and that is how we took a cornfield and turned it into a sod farm and then put it on our college football playing surface. So I'll jump right in, and really the second half of the conversation here today with Josh and Thomas are the ones that really did all the work. So they'll be the experts here. So I'll give you a little bit of history, the backstory on Jack Trice Stadium. That's the home stadium for Iowa State. It was built in 1975 and finished. And through the 1995 season, the playing surface was that traditional AstroTurf surface. Very, very common for that time period. A lot of the former athletes still talk about, how much that hurt, how they had bloody knees and joints, achy joints and pain from playing on that old surface. And so, that was very common at the time frame and multiple use as far as that goes. But Iowa State University realized in the early 90s that advancements had come along with, maintaining natural turf playing surfaces. And so they wanted to go back to that. And so just to give you a little bit of a history on the surface, before the 96 season, Mike Andreessen was hired to manage the new construction and then the new playing surface that we'd have here. And so Mike was a great addition to the athletic department, and they installed the natural grass surface before the 96 season. So originally it was a 95% sand, 5% peat root zone, and that sand met USGA specifications. And it was built over great drainage. Because we're below a floodplain, there's pumps connected and everything has to be pumped out of the stadium to keep the water moving, but the water standing has never been an issue. Because of the turnaround and the time, they actually sodded that surface. And so that was a 84% sand-based sod. And so that sod went down and it was a sandy type soil, 84% sand, but not a true sand base. And we'll talk a little bit more about that, but that caused some issues and some down the road years later that we kind of had to deal with. And so there was a quote I found in researching this, and that was, wash sod didn't work for us, but the best match for our root zone was this 84% sand-based mixture that the grass was in. And that surface was in and did very well. And it went from 96 until into the 2000s. Here's a couple pictures that Mike had actually given us. Interestingly enough here, if we look at this playing surface over here, we can see that the original surface and original design, Mike actually talked the athletic department into not putting a logo in the middle of the field. As you manage fields today, you can only imagine that chances of that actually happening nowadays with branding and things like that. But that was the original logo, was not in the center of the field. And so that's kind of a unique aspect that we had back then. Obviously, things changed and they got a logo into the middle of the field as time went on to help with branding efforts. But that was something interesting there during time. The surface, again, was 100% bluegrass, performed very well for a long time. In 2007, they started to have a 4-inch thatch layer in there, and they had a lot of annual bluegrass or Poa annua showing up in that field. Just product of that many years, as well as, that much play and bluegrass being in there. It had an aggressive aerification program, but it was an older field, and things start to build up over time. And so that field was replaced before the 2008 season, and to get rid of the annual bluegrass, And so new sod was brought in. The sod, again, was from a sandy root zone up in Wisconsin. And so, again, it wasn't a perfect match to our sand that was already present in the root zone. And so that was something to keep in mind as we move forward. So in 2019, I was visiting with Tim Van Loo, as the field manager at the time then, and our field started to have a lot of summer patch issues with it. For those of you that aren't familiar with Iowa and our seasons here, we have a very, very hot August, very humid, great for growing corn, which is one of our best crops, but hard on Kentucky bluegrass and other cool season grasses. And so that also creates a perfect environment for summer patch to really flare up and take its toll on our football field right before the season. And so we had a lot of the field that had a lot of summer patch issues on it, and just a field of that age. But it also built up over the years from aggressive sand top dressing. They'd taken that original 12-inch root zone to a depth of around 18 to 20 inches of sand. So the field was actually draining too quickly and not holding enough water in those spots where it was that high above the original root zone. And so this caused some issues with the fact they were going to have to water more often than what they wanted to, and the roots weren't chasing the water down then as much. So Tim had made the decision, or was looking at it with the athletic department, about resodding, taking the sod layer off, taking out some of that extra top dressing that we'd built up, and getting back down to that 1996 layer. And basically reusing that root zone that was down in there, because there was nothing wrong with that. And so they were going to regrade it and bring it back down to level. Of course, as he started to look around at different sod farms, things like that, he saw lots of great options out there. They were mostly a long way away. And the one thing that, didn't exactly work was the fact that none of their sands matched up with what we had present in the root zone from that 96 layer. And so I was down there visiting with Tim one day, and we talked about different options and things. And we kind of came to one, and I walked out of the stadium and decided to give Tim a call after I got out of there and said, "Hey, Tim, I've got a second option for you. What if we went with where we grew it ourselves and used the sand that matched perfectly out of one of our local quarries?" And Tim said, "That's great. That's what I was hoping you would say." And so we partnered together, the College of Ag and Life Sciences, as well as the athletic department, to grow our own sod. And this was going to be a fun project. It was going to be one that we could get students involved in and train the next generation, as well as, the athletic department could take pride and actually be able to grow the sod the way they wanted to. So that was 2019, spring of 2020. We got ready to launch this project, and COVID hit right about a week before our first truck was set to roll. And so we postponed it for a year, and just to try to see what would happen with COVID, things like that. And so we postponed it for a year, and in that time frame, Tim left, and Josh Tvrdik moved up to the field manager position, and Josh was willing to stay with us on this project and see it through. So we were excited to partner with him and continue to see this project through. So one of the first things that we did was we again took the sand specs from the local quarry, made sure that they matched the existing root zone, and that we wouldn't have any issues there. And so that was one of the first things. Once we knew we had a secure sand source, then we knew we were ready to go with this project. So the next thing was we had to find a site selection that worked and something that would be good for us. And so we found a cornfield out at the Horticulture Research Station, and that was a place where we could go and have enough space. Athletics then said to us, "You know what, let's not just replace the game field, but let's also go ahead and replace the football practice fields at the same time." So it went from a 3-acre project to 6 acres. And so we had to find 6 acres that were relatively flat as a base, and something that we could build off of and basically cover with a sand cap and install irrigation into, so that we could use it as our sod farm. And so we found that at our research facility, and I'll show you some pictures of that later. And then the other important aspect was we wanted to make sure that we did this with students in mind. And so we had to find a willing student that was willing to take this project on and learn from it, because we wanted this to be a teaching opportunity as well. One of the unique things about our university is that we have a very close relationship with our athletic department. And so the athletic department has 2 full-time employees on the turf care side, and the rest of their staff is made up of our student workers. And so we wanted to continue that tradition of working together and training our students. And so this project actually was funding a grad student. And so we got Thomas to agree to pursue his master's and then grow in the sod as well. And what a great experience to be able to be hands-on and learn everything he could about growing sod at a high level for our athletic department. And so there's a picture of Tom up there, not really knowing what he's getting into. That's why he has a smile on his face. And, you know, before he got to really experience the ins and outs of this construction. So here's a picture, an aerial picture of our horticulture research station. And so we selected these two fields here. One is right off of this hoop house here, and you can see it. That was about 3 acres there. And then the other field that we selected was right on the other side of this road. That's another 3 acres. The reason we picked these facilities or these fields was, one, they were fairly flat. Those of you that have been to Iowa realize the whole state's fairly flat, but this was some of the best area as far as that goes for us. We also had good hookups to water that we could hook into our irrigation system and be able to create the irrigation that we needed. And then the other thing was it was easy access to roads. So when it was time to harvest in and out, we could get the trucks in and out and keep them moving. And so those were our site selection. It had been corn the last few years, some beans in there as well. And so we had ample opportunity there and space to be able to go ahead and actually make our project come to fruition. So at this point, I'm going to hand it off to Tom. And he's going to tell you more about the management and the growing. And then when he's done, Josh will actually talk about growing it in a stadium. So I'll be around for questions as well.
All right. So right away at the start of the growing season, we had a subcontractor come in and look into kind of trying to get rid of the corn stalks, getting down to that native soil later, trying to get rid of any organic material, and then, you know, rough grading, as you can kind of see in these pictures here. And then essentially trying to make the subsurface as hard as possible, so that way we could essentially create a barrier between the native soil and the sand that we were going to put on top. Then just because we had such a dry spring that year, we were able to actually have the dump trucks drive immediately out onto the fields themselves to dump. So that was quite convenient for us. But it was important that we had a fairly solid rough grade below, so that way Iowa Sports Turf guys could then evenly grade the sand that we brought in to make a level playing surface that we could, or a level surface that we could reliably cut sod from. So there's kind of another look at sand being stacked onto the fields there, and then kind of looking at irrigation once it was installed, to try and settle that sand in to hopefully get it to the point where we could have grass growing on it. So we got our sand. It was 108 dump trucks with pups. And we actually had to ship it in from Omaha, Nebraska. So about a 2.5, 3 hour drive from Ames. But why from Omaha? We did a shaker test on the existing sands that we had both at Jack Trice and at Johnny Major's practice facility. And we found, you know, we were able to analyze that sand particle size distribution. And then we compared that to sands at different pits that we could get. And we found that this sand from Omaha was the best match. So I, as a part of this project, was was blessed with the responsibility of designing the irrigation system, something fairly new for me, as I'm just getting, or at the time I was just graduating with my undergraduate degree. So just some things that I had to consider, you know, the pipe sizing, looking at the flow, it was about 300 gallons per minute. So we wanted to maintain that 4-inch main line that was consistent with existing infrastructure on the farm we were at. And then based on that, we wanted to have 3-inch pipe out to the first head, and then from there 2.5-inch pipe the rest of the way. Because we knew that we were going to be growing this for sod, we wanted to make sure that we had as few irrigation heads in the field as possible, because come sod harvest, there are obstructions that we would, and then, in turn, a little bit of waste from sod harvesting. So we tried to find heads that maximize throw distance, and made sure that they were still actively or accurately covering head to head. Pressure at the source, we were looking at about 80 psi at the source, and then after fittings and working through the pipe with pressure loss, we safely assumed about 65 psi for operating pressure. With that information, just trying to figure out the greatest nozzle choice, essentially how far away I could have heads, and still have accurate water, precipitation was important. Being out in the middle of central Iowa, being a fairly flat place, the wind can howl through there fairly aggressively. So I want to be able to have heads that, were able to cover head to head. So I was fairly conservative on spacing. And so we were able to decide, we went with the Hunter I-80 heads just because they throw about 70 feet. And then the nozzle group, we were able to get it with about 35 gallons per minute per head. So with a flow rate of 300 gallons per minute, and then 120 gallons per minute per zone, the idea was that we'd be able to run 2 zones at a time across 22 zones. So that way we could be able to turn around water cycles and be able to water things quickly if we needed to. So typically the winds in Iowa come out of the northwest. So that was definitely something I had to consider with irrigation design. So my heads that I had on the north and west sides of the field had a lot more, if they were adjustables, they had a lot more leniency in terms of throw outside of the field, just to essentially kind of play for the wind. Quick couplers on each of the sod fields. We had 4 quick couplers, kind of 1 in each corner. And I had 2 100-foot hoses, and I was able to reach every part of the sod fields with that.
There's a quick question, Tom.
Yeah.
Someone wanted to know what the depth of the sand was established over the soil at the sod.
Oh, that's a good question. So, so for the truckloads, we wanted to establish about a 3-inch sand cap. By the time it was all said, and it was more like 2 3/4. We chose that height just because we wanted to be able to harvest the sod at, 1/2 inch to 3/4 of an inch sod cutting depth. So we want to make sure that we had plenty of play, and that when we were harvesting the sod, we wouldn't have any sort of native soil disturbance. So here's kind of a look at my first SketchUp of the sod fields. I think the throw with the nozzle group was like 76 feet, but you can kind of tell I have it at, the spacing at like 68.5 feet, and then 63.5 feet, I think it is here. So just kind of a look, 4 heads per zone, 5 zones on this one north field. So piecing all of these things together, putting it all in a document, sending it off to our local distributor, and then getting all of these boxes or these pallets with boxes on them was kind of a fun challenge in terms of, picking it all apart, putting it all together. I knew I had everything I needed. It was just then going back and remembering how I had ordered all the parts and putting it all together, putting this big puzzle all together. So the irrigation install itself was actually subcontracted out as well. So just some kind of looks here, how it was trenched in, and how the valves were all installed. We used Hunter valves just because that's what the athletics department has historically used and had success with. And then you can kind of see the wire getting trenched in as well. It was just a conventional block system. No crazy frills or anything like that. Oh yeah, the other thing to mention is that since this was a cornfield previously, there wasn't any live electricity that was run out to this field. So we actually had to use solar powered clocks to operate the irrigation systems, which ended up working quite well for us. So I'll go ahead and pass it over to Josh now to talk about seed selection.
We chose Mountain View Seeds 365 SS because of their we've heard great things about it. We researched, all three basically did really well on the NTEP report. And we wanted 100% Kentucky bluegrass, but we also needed, being that it was out in the middle of a cornfield, basically we knew wind would be our biggest issue. So one of the cultivars in there, Bolt, establishes very quickly. And when you have winds like we do out in the middle of the country and you have sand, the best thing you could do is have this rapid establishment, just to keep everything in place. So we were happy with our selection. We didn't, what did we go for rate? 4 pounds per thousand. We went at 4 pounds per thousand as a rate for our first attempt, and that was sufficient, and we had great results. But basically we push spread the whole thing, and then we dimple rolled it with a Sand Pro first, and then we all went behind with seeders, and all 6 acres we seeded it, and then the Sand Pro team went back after we seeded and pushed all the seed back into the ground. Yep. And Tom's back up to talk about establishment.
Yeah, so after establishment or after seeding, essentially, prior to seeding, we sprayed mesotrione at 6 ounces per acre to try and, try to prevent any crabgrass or any warm season grass emergence. Being that we were seeding in the springtime, this is all we seeded, I think, April 30th. So right in the mix there with competing with crabgrass and things like that. So we wanted to make sure that we had at least a window of protection. With mesotrione, you get about 4 weeks of pre-emergence control. And then we also put a base polymer coated urea at a pound of nitrogen per 1,000 square feet across all of the sand. And then even on top of the base polymer coated urea, we had our 12-28-17, and that was applied 2 different times, once pre-plant and then once about a month following seeding. And then it being fresh sand that we had just brought in, we wanted to make sure that it would settle and wouldn't blow away in the wind. So irrigation was quite frequent, essentially at this stage in the game, trying to keep a beach wet. So that brought some challenges that I'll talk about here in a second. So we seeded on April 30th. May 1st, the very next day, we had a very unseasonably warm day. You can kind of see here, temperatures above 85 degrees, winds with gusts, into the 40s, 45 miles an hour, on little to no humidity. So really just a real bad mixture, concoction for trying to keep seed wet, keep sand wet in the middle of Iowa. So what resulted from that, it's kind of hard to see here, but you can see the sand physically blowing across the field there. Process called saltation, where sand particles blowing in the wind will hit an additional sand particle and cause essentially a chain reaction. So kind of a rough first day of seeding. We estimate we lost about a third to 3/5 of an inch of sand just in that day alone. Even with being able to run 2 zones at a time, constantly just starting a cycle, and then as soon as it was done, start over again. We weren't really able to hold moisture just simply with irrigation alone on freshly unsettled sand, essentially. So we got together as a group, everyone from the athletics department and everybody, Dr. Thoms and the Iowa sports turf guys, and kind of went back to the drawing board in terms of, well, we got to do something. This isn't going to work. Do we try and hydroseed it? No, that's probably not a great idea for drainage reasons. There's a reason why we're doing this on pure sand. So we ended up settling on this product from Precision Labs called Shredda. It's not really used in turf grass. It's more used in specialty crops, things like almonds currently. But the idea of Shredda is that it's such a pure holder, strictly holder, and it has a different chemistry from your typical wetting agents in the way that it's more of a longer chain. So it's physically blocking the pores of the coarse sand. So we started using this. We didn't have as many warm, windy days, and we were able to kind of finally get things moving in the right direction. We had to regrade and reseed a few areas just because the sand had physically blown all 3 inches away in some choice spots on the sod fields. So definitely a unique learning experience for me, being fairly early into the job. So at about the 14-day mark after seeding, we finally were able to get some germination. You can see in the picture on the right here, the seed, definitely you can tell where the dimples had been made with the sand pros on seeding. So we were happy with that result. But about 14 days, we saw first signs of grass seed germination. And as most bluegrass is, it germinated right away, but it definitely isn't very vigorous until about 8 weeks post seeding. So it was definitely a waiting game, a game of patience. You can also see on the right with the sand cap, and it being a native soil cornfield, we had quite a lot of earthworm castings, which with it being a completely sand-based sand cap, was an interesting and fun incorporation of organic matter that we hadn't necessarily planned for. So here I have a time lapse of kind of installation. You can see the flags, everything laid out, irrigation laid out. And then, yeah, sand bringing, you can see even just the sand blowing away as it's sitting there. Then, yeah, the beginning to spread the sand. Beginning to run irrigation to try and settle the sand in. Seeding. And then finally some cloudy, cooler weather. You can see the big introduction of worm castings there, and then our first signs of green. And then, yeah, as this kind of wraps up here, this went through about the month of July. So definitely a slow process getting the seed to kind of take hold and establish. So establishment, just a lot of watering, once again, trying to stabilize the soil surface, getting it to the point where if we were to have a large rain event of sorts, we wouldn't wash any sand away. We wouldn't lose any additional seed. At this point, you know, trying to throw additional seed into weaker areas, but trying to limit that as much as possible for, you know, hopefully the bluegrass to naturally fill in with the rhizomes and result in better sod strength. So looking at this picture here, we were thinking we were making some solid progress. The Iowa Sports Herb guys came back out and gave us some drone shots. And, you know, this being in the middle of June, and, you know, it was a nice reminder that there is still quite a lot of work to do. And this isn't necessarily a product that is ready for Jack Trice Stadium quite yet. Here's kind of a look at the north field. Even with fairly close irrigation spacing, we did still see some donut formations, donut rings, if you will, just from, you know, wind interference. So definitely still something, I mean, something we were accounting for, but maybe not quite to the extent that we saw. So with kind of our issues with blowing away, you know, aggressive winds, and having to reseed and regrade a couple things, our window of seeding that we wanted to be about 4 weeks ended up being closer to 7 or 8 weeks. So because of that, we did have some encroachment of our summer annual grassy weeds like barnyard grass, crabgrass, things of that sort. So because it was a new field, new seed, based on the label, any sort of sulfentrazone or quinclorac products, you can't spray until you mow it 2 to 3 times or 28 days post emergence, whichever one comes first. For Kentucky bluegrass, since it kind of germinates and sits there, doesn't really have a lot of active top growth young in its life. 28 days after emergence, we were finally able to selectively control some of those weeds with an herbicide. Foliar fertility and growth regulation then at that point started occurring as well. So trying to push the plant, but also kind of control its top growth to try and shoot these roots down into the soil surface or into the soil profile was something we were trying to shoot for. Additionally, we wanted to try and keep out any sort of annual bluegrass with mesotrione, trying to suppress any annual bluegrass germination. Just being in that it was still kind of early in the season, we were watering quite a bit, potentially, and fertilizing quite a bit, potentially creating a hospitable environment for Poa annua, and for a complete Kentucky bluegrass field, that's an absolute no-go, non-starter. So mowing initially, mowing was an interesting ordeal just because the sand wasn't quite stable enough with the new seedlings to reliably have a triplex or a riding mower out. So the first 5 or 6 mows on the 6 acres of sod were me and one of the students walk mowing. So definitely a lot of walking to be had, but simply just something we couldn't get around. Especially this picture in the middle. This picture in the middle was the first mow. You can still see sand fairly visible in there. trying to bring in a triplex on top of that would have made quite the mess. You can see we went with a real cut, just trying to make as clean of a cut for our height of cut reduction as possible, just so that way we're we're trying to minimize as much stress as possible for the grass plant as it's growing and developing to try and keep it healthy. The height of cut was at right about 1.5 inches starting out. So definitely fairly aggressive for a Kentucky bluegrass, but since the cultivar selection we had, they're low growing compact varieties, so they took it quite well. So definitely put my watch on my mows a couple of times. Me just mowing about half of the 6 acres of sod. I walked for about 15 miles. So definitely a lot of hands-on. You got to see every inch of that sod field for sure, which was a good thing for me and for scouting reasons. And then, additionally making sure that things were hand watered, trying to minimize any hot spot formation. The fields were mostly flat, but they did still have high spots. And we did see some dry spots form in those high spots. So at this point, got our few mows in with the walk mower. We had density to the point where we felt we could get a triplex mower onto the sod fields. We weren't worried about having any sort of, rain event, any sort of wind event blow the sod away. It was really at that point pushing growth regulation and pushing fertility to make sure that the grass had any and every opportunity to grow as aggressively as possible, knowing that we had essentially a year time frame to turn around a sod field for the athletics department. So you can kind of see picture on the right, definitely starting to fill in, able to kind of stripe the thing up a little bit, which was really fun for me. And then this is a picture here on September 22nd. So definitely a stark change from June. You can still see that there are some weak areas, but that was something that we accounted for with kind of a temporary setup for sod production. We factored in some areas that would be unharvestable. So we grew 6 acres of sod. We really needed about 4.5. So that left us a fairly solid margin for error, but definitely filling in. Yeah.
Question here is, did you return clippings every mow to start?
Yeah, so the whole way we just returned clippings back into the soil profile or into the rhizosphere. Just we had seen, with it being a pure sand, trying to return those nutrients back into the soil, and especially in like a way that could be, organically decomposed and recycled back to the soil was something that we were interested in. So the whole entire process, walk mowing, triplexing the whole entire way, it was all clippings being returned back to the field. So here's another look at the other north field. You can still see definitely some weaker areas, but for the most part, at this point, we felt like these fields could play high school football on them and be okay. Solid rhizome development, could definitely tell that there was some sod strength coming into play at this point. So now looking about a month and a half later, October 12th, the field is definitely starting to hit its stride. Cool season grasses in Iowa really do enjoy the cold fall overnights. So we were definitely able to get some solid stripes at this point. Sod strength was really solid. We were able to cut pieces of sod out and kind of hold it pull it apart with your hands, but knew that there was definitely some solid sod strength. And at this point, we were starting to feel fairly confident about sod harvestability come the following spring. Some pictures more of some mow patterns I got to put in, essentially having a completely blank slate for mow patterns, not having to paint any fields or anything on this. So then as the fall progressed, we rolled into irrigation blowout on December 1st. At this point, throwing down, our last fertilizers of the year, making sure it had enough potassium to keep it hardy in a overwintering stress period. And then we put the sod to bed for the year. We put a final wetting agent down, and then we also put an anti-transpirant down, just to try and reduce the risk of winter desiccation, especially with how windy conditions in Iowa are, especially if it didn't have any snow cover on it. So in the spring, Jack Trice the old field had been removed, new irrigation heads, new valves installed. So we knew we would want to try and turn around and get this sod field as green as possible, as early as possible. Unfortunately for us, it was a fairly cool spring. So we didn't really see soil temperatures into the mid 50s until, the end of April. But we were trying to push along things with ammonium nitrate based fertilizers, with monoammonium phosphate as well, to try and push phosphorus rooting establishment. And then, the ammonium nitrate just being a quick nitrogen source, water soluble. So this is a look at the sod on April 27th. Pretty dormant still, for it being towards the end of the month. At this point, Jack Trice was wide open. And there was definitely some wanting to get the sod moved over already. But we just were not having weather to cooperate with us. So additionally, we also threw a humic coated ammonium sulfate right on this kind of April 27th, April 28th. And right about then, we started to see a little bit warmer temperatures, and then the ammonium sulfate kicking in. We essentially broke dormancy right as we were getting to harvest on May 2nd. So this is kind of a look at harvest here. Our harvesting was subcontracted out as well by Stenzel and Sod, a local sod producer, just because we didn't have any of that large scale sod equipment on hand, and kind of just went through and started harvesting sod and loading it up. So here's kind of a video of the sod being cut here. So sod kind of rolled up. It was netted, but then netting was removed upon installation. But my job at that time was kind of just to make sure that sod was cut uniformly, and that it was of quality. So picking out spots that potentially weren't suitable for being transported over to Jack Trice. Okay, at this point, we're getting sod cut, and I want to hand it back over to Josh and talk about kind of pre-plant establishment and prep down at the stadium.
So at this point, I think it's a good thing to know that when we harvested this, it was on a truck for less than an hour before we laid it onto the field. So the grass never saw any stress. And I think that's a huge part of, why this was successful. But at this point, we started laying the sod. We had one semi already staged in our tunnel where the football players run out. overnight. And then that early next morning, they started cutting. And we had a semi waiting. But we also, Iowa Sports Turf, I bet, and Stinsland Sod there's probably close to 20 to 30 guys helping lay this field. So we were literally laying sod faster than they could bring it from 6 miles out of town. But before the sod was laid, we put down our pre-plant. We did heavy organic fertilizer, and our pre-plant was Earthworks, some Smart Foss. I have it on a different slide. But yeah, every 2 weeks we were trying to punch holes in that just to drive down roots. And you can see May 20th, it was established well enough for us to needle tine it. And then by June 17th, that was our root structure. We also, almost a month later, laid the practice field. We were on schedule to do it right after Jack, but some things had happened they threw in they wanted a synthetic field on the north end, and we had to delay the project a little bit just to get the synthetic basically done before we could, the base done before we could lay the sod. One of the unique things that we did and had the opportunity to do was to put in a hybrid stitching system. Basically what this machine does is it sews a fiber into the ground 4 to 9 inches deep, and it basically stabilizes the ground. It's a lot like rebar and concrete. It's just made for stability. It was an incredible opportunity for us to do it. There's one machine in the country, and it was in Des Moines. And Iowa Sports Turf is working with the company out of Lithuania that has this machine. Here's just a picture of the GrassMax sewing machine. This will make an entire length of a football field pass. It does one pass every 6 hours. So it moves incredibly slow. There's times you don't think it's even moving, but it's basically a giant sewing machine inside that piece of equipment. And everything that is 100% ran off of electricity. So those power cords running from it are hooked up to a generator that's parked off the field. Here's some additional pictures. This is the one in the middle are the fibers. That's how close together they are. And they stick above the ground about 2 centimeters. And once the field is done and once it's over a pass, they were telling our football team, this is pretty much during football season, we're doing this. And they are saying that those guys can go out and use it right after they're done with a pass. So everything was stable and fine. And then if they needed to have a practice, the operators would pull the machine off the field and the players would come out and practice on it. They loved the surface. They thought it was amazing. They had great footing. On our end, it drastically cut down on field repair time. It's a great product. Green Bay has it. So we were very fortunate enough. That picture on the lower right is the spools of thread. And they basically sit inside that machine, and there's several tubes that run thread through tubes down to the sewing machine. Here's a better look at how it looks after it's installed and grass is established into it. Here is August 8th. Johnny's done, the practice field is done. It's been stitched. And this is Jack. We have not yet stitched this. It has been grown in though. We did our pre-plant fertilizer, and then we would continuously hit it. We'd aerate it. We would put down, we were noticing that the nitrogen, since it was so clean sand and we had very little organic matter, we were leaching pretty bad just through the sand, and we were not be able to keep an organic. So we were putting down a slow release. We were hitting it with a lot of organic, like Earthworks, in a product out of Anderson's called Smart Phos, which is just a slow release phosphorus. And here's a little bit of the practice that we did. I took some pictures 3 days after sodding, 5 days after sodding, and 9 days post sod. And the grass, this blended grass was incredibly aggressive. Even after football games, the next game, we were impressed at how much it just repaired itself. So there again, it goes to show we were happy with our selection of our cultivar. Not sure the date on that, but clearly before the football season. And there's another picture of that must be right before the game because the field's painted. So I'm gonna hand it back over to Adam at this point. And he's gonna talk a little bit more. Thank you.
So obviously here it is all painted up for the first game. We're happy with it. It's become a point of pride. We couldn't have done it without the students as far as that goes. And they really got a lot of outside the box experience, outside the classroom, hands-on, whether it be calibrating fertilizer spreaders or pushing, you saw them pushing the seed spreaders as well as helping fertilize. Obviously we had 2 master students that grew the field in as sod. And so that was great. And then even up to the painting that you see there, the students are a major part of that program in helping with athletic department work. So it was a great opportunity for them. I think it's a great chance. We used it as a tool to train them for the next generation of field managers. And so we're excited about that. To the point where we liked it so much, we continued our partnership. And so right now, currently, Iowa State has an artificial soccer field that they're removing, and we're growing sod for them for their soccer field, and it will now be a natural surface field. So we seeded that on July 23rd, not exactly the ideal seeding window, but they want to use it next July. So we had to get it going as soon as we could. We went between 2 and 3 pounds per 1,000 square feet. One of the things we learned, we went at a higher seeding rate on the football field sod at 4 pounds per 1,000, and that was too high. And so we went with a little bit leaner seeding rate, thinking that that'll still fill in quick enough for us, but we wanted to have a little less seed per area just because it was too dense and maybe didn't give us the rhizome development as quickly as what we wanted. So that was one of the things we learned and took away. We used a very similar pre-plant setup. Again, we relied heavily on the wetting agents early in the process to hold water and cut back some of our early watering needs. So here it is, August 17th. So we're a little under a month after seeding. You can see it's starting to come in and green up, and we're making progress there. And then here it is in September as it's going to the fall. And so, again, we're making good progress as far as that goes. With that, I think we've got about 10 minutes or so for questions, or maybe 5, I guess, sorry. And so I guess we'll open it up to the chat if anyone has any questions that we haven't answered. If not, we certainly enjoyed having you learn about this unique project. We're always open to answer anything. If anybody has anything, that wants to follow up one-on-one, we'd love to share our learning experience.
All right, thanks everyone. And as Adam said, it looks like there's a question there.
Did you add more sand to the base at the research farm for the new soccer grow-in?
Yeah, it's a great question. So did we add more sand to the base for the new soccer grow-in? We did add, we had to add back about a 1/2 inch to make up for what we took away with the sod from the football field.
All right, looks like that's it.
Scott asked if it was the same acreage.
Good question. So was it the same acreage? This time we're only doing 3 acres. So it's like half the work.
Brian's asking, why did you choose not to install drain tile?
Yeah, so good question on the drain tile. Number one, the fields were tiled underneath. We thought it would be a one-off project, and so that's kind of why we did it we thought we had enough surface slope to drain it good enough. Looking back, it probably would have been better to have tiled the whole site too, since we're doing everything the way we were.
All right, well, thank you, everyone. Please be sure to register and join us for the next 3 weeks of post-conference education. It takes place every Tuesday at 2:00 p.m. Eastern Time and 3:15 p.m. Eastern Time. If you have any additional questions for this group, please get in touch with them by phone or email. Thank you all for joining us today and have a great rest of the week.